Hello, my name is Colin Litzinger. This is my informative speech on Giuseppe Garibaldi. Now, who is Giuseppe Garibaldi? Giuseppe Garibaldi was an Italian general, a Republican, not the party, advocate for republics, anti-papist, Freemason, bunches and bunches of other things. Famous hero during his time of global recognition, particularly in the Americas, both of them, and Europe. Now, before we really get into this, there is more to talk about Giuseppe Garibaldi than I have time for in this video. And I do not have time to explain most of the geopolitical context because there was no United Italy at the time. South America, some of the places where he fought, was a mess, and it would just take a few hours to really cover in any detail. But to start from the beginning, Giuseppe Garibaldi was born to a family of relatively modest means, a seafaring family, in the city of Nice, which is actually in modern-day France, but was contested between France and the Kingdom of Piedmont, which was one of the many Italian powers at the time. And, well, his family, at the very least, and everything else, believed themselves very strongly to be of the Italian persuasion, and that was really a relatively new phenomena. The idea of a unified Italy, that dream, and the overall just being fed up with Austrians and the French interfering in affairs of the Italian peninsula and its various powers. Now, there were a lot of revolutions and uprisings at this time, and Garibaldi ends up getting himself involved in one. It fails, and he is promptly condemned to death. So, he escapes to South America. What does he start doing in South America? Well, he starts fighting. He actually acts as a privateer, and raids shipping, and during numerous conflicts, including what's known as the Ragamuffin War. Now, I know that sounds silly, but that was a very real war. People died. There was a small state created briefly. It didn't last long. And he'd become most famous for his actions in the Uruguayan Civil War, which was actually a war between what we know as Uruguay and Argentina. Now, he would create a force of Italian volunteers known as the Red Shirts. Why were they known as the Red Shirts? Well, when you raise an army, you need uniforms, and there was a deal on red shirts. The name stuck, the uniform stuck, and he kept it together. And he ended up winning a number of battles and everything, but one of his most famous was the Battle of San Antonio del Salto. Now, by this point, he's becoming quite famous for all his successes and escapades and everything else. Not all the causes he fights for actually survive, but he has proven himself to be a very capable general. And there's a bit of a need for that now, and he is eventually more or less called back to the Italian peninsula. Now, while he was a follower of the Young Italy movement and the Italian nationalist Mazzini, he eventually has to give that up. He eventually pragmatically allies himself with the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, and fights in a number of conflicts. He would include, I have a list here, he would become the provincial government of Milan. He became a general and the Minister of War briefly. He was the general of the Roman Republic in 1849, which was some of his forces briefly managed to take over Rome because the papal state controlled a decent portion of Italy, but then after successfully beating back the French came back, sieged the place again, and it took over. So the Roman Republic did not last. In 1859, he led a force which was known as the Hunters of the Alps, which was an irregular force of mountain soldiers. He ended up capturing major cities such as Lombardy, Cormo, Versace. Following year, he led the Expedition of 1,000. His military escapades were numerous. Some were ultimately successful, some weren't, but he never had, there's always a winner and a loser in a war, more or less. But he never embarrassed himself as a general, and he pretty much always led irregular volunteer forces in guerrilla warfare. So that's what he did. And all of these battles, all these wars, laid the groundwork for the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia to really take control of the Italian peninsula, and eventually what that'll do is that will end up morphing into the Italian state we know today. His last major conflict would be in the Franco-Prussian War. But by this time, his fame, he is so incredibly popular. He was actually, at the start of the American Civil War, he was actually offered a position as a general. Now, his condition for this was that slavery be made a key issue, and that, the abolition of slavery. But if you know anything about the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln at the time, at the beginning, there's a reason he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation when he did. Lincoln did not want to take that political risk just yet, so his position as a general fell through, and he ended up fighting in another war somewhere else. But the fact that he was that famous, to also put in perspective, the 39th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment was named the Garibaldi Guard after him in the Civil War. Yet there was another unit, even on the Confederate side, that was named after him. That's just how famous he was. The man's got 7 cities named after him in South America and Italy. He's had 5 major Italian Navy ships named after him, including cruisers, destroyers, even a full-on aircraft carrier. Yeah, it's hard to really express just how much of an impact this man had during his time alive. He was involved in close to a dozen wars and conflicts, held a bunch of major positions. He really changed the world as we know it, in large parts, especially in Europe, and that would have major impacts and all the way into World War I, World War II, and even the modern era. It was the unification of a country that had been unified in close to 1,000 years, for being entirely honest. It had been several hundred since the fall of the Roman Empire, and that's a major thing. And I just hope you learned something, and I hope everyone else has a good time on their speeches. Thank you very much. Goodbye.